Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 23 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Aden Magee, a retired U.S. Army military intelligence officer and author. Aden served in the Army for more than 22 years in many different positions, including as a human intelligence collector and counterintelligence agent. Since retiring in 2005, he's worked as a consultant to the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and has published many articles and books. I asked Aden to join me on the podcast to talk about his most recent book, The Cold War Wilderness of Mirrors, Counterintelligence, and the U.S. and Soviet Military Liaison Missions 1947 to 1990. Aden, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to me about this incredible period of history that you've written about.
Yeah, Justin, it's great to be with you.
Thank you. I know that you served in a number of critical roles during the Cold War. So is any of this particular book based on your own personal experiences?
Yeah, it sure is. In fact, when I began this project, I was going to have it kind of just bounded on the last decade that I spent in the Cold War over in Europe, living some of these events. But as I started to do the research and peel it back, I realized that there was a much larger historical backstory that had to be told with this to put it into the proper context. So what began as a pretty bounded and limited project grew bigger and bigger, and it's been kind of an effort that's been ongoing for the last 7 to 10 years now.
Oh, wow. Sounds like quite a passion project for you in that case.
Yeah, it is. And all the Freedom of Information Act requests that I had to go through and debate and try to get information declassified, that was a big challenge, but it was worth all of the effort.
Yeah, I feel that way too, because I personally, there's a special place in my heart, honestly, for the missions. I've read quite a bit about them. I've even written a little bit about them in the past. And when I got your book, I was so glad to see that there was like this top-down perspective that is kind of lacking from a lot of the more personal accounts. So you got to see the reason that this was created and how it was created and how these unique organizations were founded and how they worked against each other and with each other on occasion. It was really interesting stuff. So I was very appreciative that you went to the effort to get all of this stuff declassified, as you said, and then kind of aggregated so we can really see the whole picture and not just the ground soldier's view, so to speak.
Glad to hear that.
So let's just go ahead and start off. Can you tell me how, or can you tell us how and why these military liaison missions were created in the first place?
Yes, during the last months of World War II, as the NATO, the Allied powers, the US, the Soviets, the British, the French were coming to an agreement on how they were going to administer Germany after the war, they agreed to, for the purposes of administration, to divide Germany into 4 sectors, which became occupied Germany. And each of the Allied powers would occupy one of those 4 zones for the purposes of rebuilding Germany and bringing them back into the fold of the international community. One of the provisions in that agreement was that each of the Allied powers would establish with their headquarters a military liaison mission from the other allies for the purposes of communication. And as we know, during the first 2 years after the war ended, things weren't going so well. And most of the provisions of that agreement had really fallen apart. The Soviets were going in their own direction, putting Communist Party members in all of the government agencies within their sector. So at that time, things were going bad. So the Allied powers still agreed that this one provision in the agreement should be exercised because it would be beneficial to have some type of a direct liaison between the powers so there's no uncertainty, ambiguity, any type of a strategic mishap. So the powers agreed to establish an MLM They were established under 3 different agreements. Each of the French, the British, and the Americans had a agreement with the Soviets, and our agreement, which was referred to as the Hübner-Millennium Agreement, established that there would be a military liaison mission established in Potsdam, Germany, near East Berlin, with the group of Soviet forces Germany, and there would be a Soviet military liaison mission located in Frankfurt, West Germany.
Okay, I see. So you've got 4 different countries in the end, and 3 are mostly allied, and 1 is slowly turning adversarial, I would say. Was this liaison mission, I mean, did it ever amount in very much liaison, or did it turn pretty quickly into what we now know was like a collection mission that they were running on each other?
Yes. So the Hübner-Millennium Agreement had it specified that there would be 14 personnel assigned to each of the MLMs. There would be 10 vehicles accredited. And there were some logistical provisions, but there was one key provision in the agreement that really set in motion how the game of cat and mouse was going to take place for the next 43 years of the Cold War. And that was the provision that said that each of the MLMs would have free rights of travel throughout the entire sector, with the exception of locations of units of military disposition. So this very vague provision of the agreement allowed the MLMs then to roam throughout the countryside in the other's sector and basically collect intelligence on the other. And there was nothing really in the provision that kind of specified what they meant by except locations of military disposition. So right off the bat, these missions became primarily collection activities, and the stated purpose of liaison became a secondary priority at best. So that was a very unique kind of a manifestation of how the agreement came into play. And even there was kind of a terms of art that came in. They referred to these collection missions as tours, so they didn't have to use the dirty language of intelligence collection. They referred to their officers as tour officers, their NCOs as tour NCOs. And so the game was on, and they were collecting throughout the other sector, and they were considered the best sources of intelligence on the Soviet military organization and capabilities. Then 2 years later, in 1949, for the first time, the Soviets implemented a regimen of how they were going to specify what were the locations of units of military disposition, and they provided the Allies a map of their sector with shaded out areas, which signified what were the areas that they were restricted from travel. So the Allies responded in kind, provided their maps with restricted areas. And so by then, the tours in the restricted areas became kind of the accepted norms, which couldn't kind of play the rules of the game.
I think I recall from your book that these maps were kind of being constantly updated by both sides, and there seemed to be a lot of shifting lines of prohibited areas and some confusion there quite a bit, and the signs. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit? Like, were these all intentional acts with trying to confuse the tour officers from the adversarial countries, for example?
I don't think there were intentional acts. I think there was just a lot of poor communication on the parts of the Soviets and the East Germans. But yeah, in addition to what we refer to as the permanently restricted area maps, they also a few times every year would issue maps with temporary restricted areas. And these were areas that were established for 3 to 30 days, generally to cover up training activities that were taking place. And one of the agreed upon rules between the MLMs was that the MLMs were able to travel on roads that were surrounding the restricted areas and autobahns that ran through the restricted areas. And this was one of the provisions that really wasn't well understood by the Soviet troops on the ground or the East Germans. So a lot of the what we call detentions, where they would stop US MLM members for suspected or alleged PRA or restricted area violations, were really when they were traveling in those areas that they would have been allowed to.
I've got you. I've seen some pretty harrowing film clips online already of these guys, like they're backing up and they're being chased by Soviet soldiers, or the Soviet cargo trucks are turning right in front of them and intentionally blocking their way. And it sounds like, confrontations were a very, very common thing to happen throughout all the years of these missions.
Yes, and it was. And the operating environment was significantly different in the Soviet sector than it was in the U.S. or the other Allied sectors. The East Germans took their sovereignty very seriously. The Soviets took their operation security of their military forces very seriously. So their approach to defending against the MLMs was much different than what their MLMs experienced in the West.
So with this agreement in place, like you mentioned, one of the provisions was kind of vaguely worded and led to just like a complete spiraling off of the original mission intent. How did this agreement stay in place? Why didn't one side or the other just end this agreement? Was it valuable to both sides as an intelligence collection tool? Were they willing to put up with the risks of the adversarial collection in order to get their own collection going, or what exactly? I'm shocked that this situation kept going for so long.
Well, so you've asked the big mystery question that we still had to contend with. So from the very beginning of the missions, the Allied missions had an advantage in that they had a safe haven or a free zone in West Berlin. So essentially they could go directly from their mission in East Berlin and go to West Berlin. So very quickly, that was where all the mission families were living. So the U.S. decided to establish their real key facility in West Berlin, which was really a robust facility. And then the one in Potsdam was just for ceremonial purposes. And so in addition to the 14 individuals who were accredited to be mission members, they augmented them with an additional up to 56 personnel operating out of West Berlin. And so what this enabled them to do was they were constantly switching out tour officer accreditations, consistently switching out vehicle accreditations. And they also had a very robust intelligence analysis and protection facility operating out of Berlin. And on the other hand, and the other allies had kind of similar type of activities. On the other hand, the US MLM in Frankfurt was basically landlocked. They maintained their 14 people. They probably could have arranged some type of a sanctuary deal, bringing something down close to the German border near Czechoslovakia, but they just continued to operate with their 14 people, even when the US and the other allied missions were, basically running what had become the DoD's most prolific intelligence collection capability of that time. So that brings the same question that you asked. Why, at a time, this was absolutely unique because the Soviets, who always significantly overmatched the West in terms of counterintelligence and human capability, in this one instance, why was it that they would allow this disparity of overmatch in this case? But there must have been something that they were getting out of the deal that would make them, keep those missions alive for the next 43 years. And perhaps we'll touch on some of the things that it may have been the reason for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's still so many questions that haven't been answered, even decades after all this has died down and the world's moved on, it seems like, but there's still a lot of enduring mysteries for sure, some of which you talk about in your book, of course. So I have to ask you, these liaison personnel, I mean, when you talk about the word liaison, it's essentially, different groups of people getting along, right? We're obviously in confrontations with each other's countries, but did these liaison officers, did they get along well amongst each other? Were the Soviets mingling with the American tour officers and the British tour officers, for example? Or was there more of like a rivalry there?
Well, they got along. They got along well. They were professionals, and they all wanted to make sure that the missions continued. But really, most of the mission personnel didn't interact with their Soviet or U.S. hosts. Really, the only direct communication that the Soviets and the U.S. had at the official officer type level was at the very highest level. And of course, they had to maintain their military decorum. And also, it was really not in anybody's advantage to establish any type of relationship, because we knew and they knew that any information that they provide or insights that they provide on themselves is only going to go into a dossier that might be used to exploit them at some future time. So there was really no practical purpose of doing that. And also, anybody that became too friendly with one or the other would be considered a counterintelligence vulnerability and either lectured or pulled out of the area.
Right.
So there was just one example that I can think of a kind of a relationship that was established. Sit back, it's a little bit of a story, but there was one U.S. MLM tour officer in the 1979 timeframe who was the best Russian linguist that they had. So he would be the one chosen to support all these high-level general officer discussions, negotiations. And also at that time, the GRU officer, who was the head of the agency that hosted the US MLM, was a very polished officer with great English skills. So in many times when this USMLM officer was supporting these negotiations or discussions, this GRU officer would help him out when he was kind of struggling to find the right word in Russian. The GRU would kind of whisper in his ear and help him out. So he kind of grew an affinity for this GRU officer. They liked each other. 1979, they split and left in different directions on cordial terms. So fast forward 2 years later, and this same USMLM officer is now a defense attaché at the embassy in Moscow. And this was a time in 1981 where January of 1981, when there was a lot of tension because there was a lot of concern that the Soviets were building up forces to move into Poland and put down the labor unrest. So at this time, the embassy in Moscow was feverishly trying to get its attachés over to the border with Poland and Ukraine. And so they were putting in these daily requests to be able to travel. And of course, the Soviets on a daily basis, pro forma, were denying the request until one request for travel on 13 January was just out of the blue approved. And, somebody should have questioned. The Soviets don't do things for no reason, but it was never questioned. They were anxious to get people down to see what the situation was on the ground. So coincidentally, the officer whose name was on this request to travel is the same officer who was the USMLM 2 years prior. So he and his defense attaché partner, they take a train to Kiev, they get an embassy car, they drive to their hotel where they're going to stay the night and then travel to their mission area the following day. What hadn't dawned on them was that this day was 13 January, and by the Orthodox calendar, that's New Year's Eve. So when they got to the hotel, there was a pre-festive environment going on. So they decided this would be a good opportunity to mingle with the local populace. And so they went to the restaurant bar, very crowded. There wasn't a table available, hardly room to stand. And so they sat, had a drink, and they recognized after a couple of minutes that there was a table out in the middle of the floor that was completely empty. Waited a couple of more minutes, took a look at the table. It's still empty. So they decided to go have a seat. A few minutes later, a couple of attractive Ukrainian women sit down, ask if they could have a drink with them. One thing leads to another. One of the attachés is drugged. The other one ends up in a hotel room with one of the ladies. That night, the KGB busts in, takes pictures, and that attaché is confronted with the bad news that he will probably become the middle of an international incident. So the following day, the two attachés tried to sneak out if they could. They got to their car. It was broken down. They weren't able to start. So the officers had to go back to the hotel and contact the embassy to let them know that they were marooned. And as the defense attaché went back to the hotel lobby, who do you think was standing there but that very GRU officer that he had known at the USMLM a couple of years prior? They recognized each other, spoke, agreed to go and meet in the restaurant the following night. Or that evening. So that evening they met in the restaurant while they were waiting for their meal. They decided to take a walk, have a smoke. The conversation very quickly moved to the events of the previous night. The GRU officer told the defense attaché, hey, I can make this whole thing go away. Your bosses will never know that it happened. The defense attaché, he recognized, okay, this is the pitch. I'm being recruited, made it very clear to the GRU officer that he did not want to accept his offer for help. The next day, he got back to the embassy. He reported the incident, and 2 days later, he and his family were flown back to the United States. And one of the interesting aspects of this story is that at that time, that defense attaché, who had previously been a USMLM member, was being vetted as a military advisor to President or Vice President George Bush in the Reagan administration. So obviously the KGB had identified that this guy would be a potential mole or insider inside the executive branch of the U.S. government, saw that the relationship that he had formed with this GRU officer was probably the best opportunity to pitch him. And so that was the tack that they took. Also, it's very likely or very possible that while this individual was at USMLM, they had identified some attributes of his that they decided might have made him susceptible to this type of honey trap, exploitation, recruitment activity. So that's really the best example that I have of a meaningful relationship, but I think it was much more potentially meaningful for the KGB than it was for the USMLM officer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're never afraid to use human weakness against you, for sure. And that would have been a tremendous catch for them if he's going right to the White House and to the Bush administration after that. That would have been incredible, for sure. Incredible catch.
Yes, it would.
So it does sound like then that these were liaison missions on paper only. It doesn't sound like there was any hand holding or anything like that went on, and it would just turned into yet another battlefield of the Cold War, almost right from the start and through the entire length of the thing up through 1990.
Yes, and it did. And of course, as relations really broke down beside the powers, they certainly were not talking about rebuilding Germany. So really the only reason they had to liaison with each other was to complain about what the missions were doing in regards to their intelligence collection operations. So that was kind of the irony of that, was really they gave themselves the only reason they needed to liaison for.
Sure, absolutely. So we've been talking about the U.S. and the Soviet missions so far. What about the British and the French? How did those missions, were they very different from the Soviet and U.S. objectives and operations, or were they very similar?
No, very similar. The only difference was the size of the missions. Both the British and the French missions were bigger than the U.S. mission in terms of personnel and vehicles. But again, I've told you how the U.S. kind of made up for that smaller number. But other than that, they coordinated all of their activities. The Allied MLMs split the Soviet sector of East Germany into 3 areas. They would each take 2-week blocks where they would operate in those areas and then switch off. So they were very efficient as far as their collection in the Soviet area. And this again gets to that dichotomy that you kind of asked about earlier, because as you look at it, the Soviets were operating MLMs out of one of each of the 3 sectors in the West, whereas the Allies had their MLMs saturated in the one Soviet sector. So even if you don't even take into account how they used their West Berlin sanctuary to even make their capability more robust, just if you look at it by the basic numbers, they were being out-collected 3-1. And again, it's just not like the Soviets to accept that type of overmatch.
Right, absolutely. That's a really good point, as a matter of fact. So you've been talking a little bit about these tours. Can you tell me exactly what a tour entailed? These were like a multi-day event, were they not?
Yeah, for the most part. Well, there is a difference between the U.S. and the Soviet side, and it primarily had to do with the operational environment. So the Soviet sector, well, there were 20 divisions in the Soviet Army. There were 6 divisions in the group of Soviet forces. So basically, the Soviet sector was just one big military maneuver area. So it was a target-rich environment for the Allied MLMs. On the other hand, the Allies respected West German sovereignty. And so with the exception of maybe one large exercise per year, they restricted most of their training to garrison locations and then their big training facilities, 3 of which they had, 2 were in the U.S. sector, is where they did their major military maneuvers. So there wasn't in it a lot going on. And the U.S. only had 4 divisions at the height, and then it scaled down to 2 divisions with only 2 brigades each. So there wasn't a whole lot of military activity going on. And the only thing that was going on of interest was taking place at the training location. So whereas East Germany was just one big collection opportunity, the collection opportunities for the Soviets in East Germany from the tactical reconnaissance standpoint were pretty bounded by the training locations.
Okay, sure. And when these missions went on, these guys, so it was one officer and one NCO. Was that the same for all 4 countries involved, just pairs going out?
Yeah, for the most part, because that enabled them to maximize what they were able to do. So the U.S., we would have maybe 3 or 4 tours going on simultaneously, and these tours were 1, 2, 3, and even 4-day tours ongoing. So and the Brits and the French were doing the same thing. And so over the longevity of the MLMs, the U.S. MLM averaged 900 tour days per year. So that gives you an idea of how significant their touring was. Again, they were the most prolific DoD intelligence collection element. They were producing, on average, 1,300 intelligence reports per year. So that's pretty significant.
Oh, yeah.
The Soviets, on the other hand, the Soviets out of the Frankfurt mission, they would travel on average 5 tours per week, Monday through Friday. They would leave the compound at about 7:30 or 8, go to one of the training areas usually, which were 3 hours away, take a look at what was going on at the training area, and then come back and be home in time for dinner. And the reality is they could probably find out what units are at what training ranges by just looking in the Stars and Stripes newspaper. And also in retrospect, when we look at the large difference between what the MLMs were, our MLMs were doing as opposed to the Soviet MLMs. And again, in retrospect, when you look at the types of George Trofimov, Johnny Walker, Clyde Conrad, James Hall, the amount of information that the Soviets had regarding U.S. plans, U.S. military structure, U.S. capabilities, the MLMs couldn't have collected anything that could have augmented that body of intelligence that they already have. So it looked more like, their one-a-day tours were probably just showing that they cared, just hopefully not to demonstrate that they didn't even need to tour because they might have this information through other sources.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense now that you mention it. Okay, yeah, it's kind of almost like an operational cover to cover up what their actual like agents in our organizations in the Army, for example.
Yeah, and there were quite a few, and some we may not even know about to this day.
Absolutely. So the personnel that were selected for these missions, how exactly were they selected? Like what were the factors that went into picking someone for this and equipping them and sending them out to the field?
Yeah, for ours, we had a very standardized and robust attaché program. The officers that went to USMLM went through the defense attaché program, which means normally they were already captains, majors, lieutenant colonels that have already done probably some type of a combined arms type MOS prior to being selected to go to the school. It was a 2-year program where they went through language training, cultural awareness, some type of elicitation, intelligence techniques. And so the MLM members, they went to the Marshall Center in Garmisch, West Germany for their training. And the US MLM was a plum assignment. So normally the top 2 graduates from any given year would be the ones that would go to US MLM first. So they were very well trained, but they were trained as kind of tactical collectors. Whereas on the other hand, the GRU officers that manned the MLMs were your standard GRU officers that would go to residencies in embassies. So they went through the same clandestine UMINT covert operations training that KGB officers went through. So they were trained, and not, whereas our officers were trained more on the tactical intelligence. What came to our attention pretty late in the game was that these US SMLMF members were the real deal trained GRU officers.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Yeah, they had the full scope of the intelligence operations, and would it be accurate to say that the US MLM members had more of a like limited to this particular mission training when they went out?
Yeah, well, they were not authorized. We did not conduct any type of clandestine or covert operations. They were strictly what we refer to as overt UMINT collectors. So that was what they were trained to do. They were trained to hide, camouflage themselves and be able to identify when a tank has some variation that we haven't seen before.
Okay, absolutely. So can you give any examples like the one you just mentioned, the new variant of a tank, any like concrete examples of a major success that came from the tours in East Germany?
Yeah, there's the one that's kind of US MLM legend, which was the one that occurred the evening of New Year's Eve, 1983, 1984, where the USMLM took advantage of some drunk Soviet soldiers, and they were able to go inside of the latest tank variant that the Soviet Army had. And they were able to take pictures from inside the tank that gave details regarding that tank that had never been provided before. Unfortunately, within 2 months of that intelligence coup, the KGB was aware of it because it was reported to them by James Hall.
Yeah, it seems like we had a lot of short-lived victories for sure during the Cold War, that kind. The stuff that we find, It winds up getting right back to the enemy anyway through other means, unfortunately. But like you said, this was a lot of like ground forces intelligence kind of stuff. They weren't doing any source operations or any of the traditional spycraft kind of stuff that we talk about. So it was more about hardware being fielded. Were they looking at like maneuver tactics or anything like that, or was it more about the unit makeup and the hardware that they were issued?
No, they were looking at everything that we would call tactical order of battle information. They were looking to see how they were organized. They were professionals at reading bumper numbers and understanding based on the bumper numbers where that piece of equipment stood in the Soviet organization. And so they were the ones that were the best source that provided the U.S. and the Allies information on the capabilities and the organization of the Soviet Army.
Okay. Okay. And the Soviets, you said that they handled their tours quite a bit differently, but are you aware of any successes that they had? Anything that's ever come through with into the Soviet Union or been declassified by the KGB or GRU, for example?
Well, unfortunately, none of their successes were identified by U.S. counterintelligence, and there's no record of any kind of intelligence coup that they, similar to what we saw with the U.S. MLM. However, in 1978, 1979, there was a GRU defector. He had been at a GRU residency in Sweden who defected to the Brits and told the SIS that the Soviets considered their three MLMs in West Germany as residencies, and he provided reports of two events that he was aware of walk-ins of U.S. military members to a unidentified Soviet military liaison mission in West Germany. In first case, it was a NCO who offered to sell cipher capabilities and codes, and he was paid handsomely for it and recruited as an agent. And then there was a walk-in who was a Army major who offered to sell the GRU or the KGB a nuclear artillery shell. So this defector and the information he provided to the Brits kind of either got lost in the clutter, or the Brits thought it was information that the U.S. was probably already aware of. So the information that he provided really didn't start to resonate until about the 1983 to 1984 timeframe, but he was only there for 4 years. And so these two events that took place in 4 years, there's nothing to say that they were the only two events. And certainly you wouldn't think that these two events were the only two that were taking place throughout the entire history of the MLMs. And for a number of reasons, the argument could be made that it was logical that these two soldiers went to the Soviet military liaison mission in the U.S. sector. But still, if it was tradecraft of one MLM to Soviet MLM to accept walk-ins, it would have been tradecraft for all three.
I see. I wasn't aware of that story about that nuclear artillery shell. That's very interesting for sure. I'm going to have to read more about that. Do you happen to recall that guy's name, that major that offered that up?
No, and I don't know if that was ever identified, but really what it was a ruse. He offered to provide them a artillery shell. He provided some very sensitive information to establish his bona fides, but his real end game was to get a big paycheck for providing the shell. So he offered that he would provide the shell to them. They would have 2 months to examine it, and then he would take it back. And they thought that was a pretty credible plan because they would be able to examine it, and then he could get it back without them ever having known that it had been taken. But as it turns out, according to these sources, the major made a very intricate duplicate of the shell. He was able to get some kind of nuclear waste put in it that was able to give it a reading. So, but then when they got back to Moscow, they realized that it was a fake, and they had given him a suitcase full of banknotes for nothing. But rather than, and I guess he had timed his move back to the States when this happened, and I guess he correctly assumed that the GRU, rather than letting this embarrassing event become known, would not take any type of retribution.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. I was going to say, when you mentioned that they could have it for 2 months, I was thinking there's no way that a nuclear artillery shell doesn't get inventoried more than, less than once every 2 months or so. But now it makes perfect sense the way you put it. That was a smart move on his part, I have to admit. Risky too.
Yeah, I'll say.
Now, before we go on, I want to take a moment to fill you guys in on the newest tool that I'm wearing and carrying in daily life. It's the Donovan non-metallic knife from Black Triangle. If you aren't familiar with Black Triangle, then you're really missing out. I love these guys because they put the dagger in Cloak and Dagger. If you've been following me for a while now, then you probably already know why Black Triangle has called their newest non-metallic knife the Donovan. It's named after General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Under Donovan, the OSS was unconventional, unexpected, and highly effective, just like Black Triangle's tools. The Donovan is manufactured here in the United States and is made entirely of G10 composite and comes with a thermoplastic sheath and a couple of amazing extras, which you'll have to see for yourself. You can find it at blacktriangle.com. That's blktriangle.com. You can also get 15% off your first order with Black Triangle using the discount code Spycraft101. I love mine, and I know that you're going to love yours too. Aden, so I have to ask then, we've talked about a lot of the successes, but there were some very serious risks as well, and we kind of touched on some of the confrontations early on. But can you talk a little bit more about the level of danger that these guys were facing when they headed into East Germany?
Oh, yeah, much more so in East Germany than the U.S. sector. Now, there was a tactic that was used, which is called detentions, which was really the use of 2 or 3 vehicles to try to detain a MLM vehicle ostensibly when it was inside a restricted area so they could prove that there was a violation. Now, the Soviets and the East Germans were very proficient at their detention capabilities, much less so in the U.S. sector. In fact, normally the detentions that happened in the U.S. sector were just a result of some aggressive soldiers out there doing it. It was never orchestrated by the U.S. And in fact, one of the things that you'll find is that the usurer U.S. Army Europe leadership understood that USMLM was their most prolific intelligence collection capability. And so as long as they were able to continue to collect the way they were very happy. And so anything that happened in the U.S. sector that might impact their mission, they didn't really support it that much. And detention was one of those things, because if a SMLM-F vehicle was detained in the West German sector, then USMLM could expect that within the next 2 or 3 days, they were going to have a detention. It would probably be a pretty violent one as well. And that the usurer leadership did not think that, whatever they gained by detaining a SMLM-F vehicle would be worth the impact on the intelligence mission. So there really wasn't a whole lot of that type of thing going on the Western sector as time went on. Then there were 2 other tactics that were employed by both the East Germans and the Soviets, never were used in the Western sector. The first one being vehicle rammings. And these were, as the term implies, very violent rammings of vehicles by military trucks. Both the East Germans and the Soviets used this tactic. And then there was also the tactic of, there were many shooting incidents throughout the years as well. And so, but what these kind of higher risk really demonstrated is that the agreement with the Soviets, the Eubner-Malenin agreement, it was basically an international agreement that had international standing. So anything that took place under the provisions of this agreement were basically accepted under international law. So the U.S., by not saying, they would protest rammings and shootings in the most demanding terms, but they never went to the point that said, okay, that's it. This is a deal breaker. We're shutting down the mission. Or if this happens again, this is a deal breaker. We're shutting down the mission. These things continued to occur and they were never resolved. So by allowing these incidents to occur, they basically became accepted under international law as a international norm. And in fact, when the Soviets killed one of the U.S. MLM members in 1985, they used that as their justification for having been able to do this in the past.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that one. That's a very famous case, I know for sure. You're talking about Major Nicholson, right? Arthur Nicholson?
Yeah, so Major Nicholson, he was the first and the only U.S. MLM killed in action. This was March of 1985, and they were touring a tank storage shed that was frequented by MLM members throughout the years. They were looking to see if they could identify any latest variants of tanks. And they were at the shed location. They thought they were alone. A Soviet sentry came out of the wood line, fired a shot that went past the ear of the US MLM driver. And then Major Nicholson started running from the sentry toward the vehicle, was hit with 2 bullets, and laid there and bled out on the ground.
Yeah, I've seen pictures from the scene, and it's really horrible. Seeing, obviously you've got Major Nicholson just laying there lifeless on the ground, and you can see a couple of Soviet sentries kind of in the far background, and his driver is just trapped there inside the vehicle. He can't exit the vehicle or he'll be shot as well. And it's just incredibly tense and incredibly tragic scene, I can imagine, especially since there's been so many years of this operation without a death like that. So it must have been just quite an event then for sure, and quite a tragedy. Maybe not a totally unexpected one, but incredible tragedy after so many years of
yeah, it was.
And tours.
Interestingly, this was the second KIA in the mission history, and it was happened almost to the day a year after the previous one, and that was a French military liaison member officer who was killed in a East German vehicle ramming. And so since at the time the French didn't have any diplomatic relations with the East Germans, they didn't really have much recourse. But what both of those examples provide, both the one with the French officer and Major Nicholson, was the the high degree of risk that USER and the MLMs were willing to accept just so their intelligence collection mission continued. Because again, in both of those very egregious events, they were never considered deal breakers to shut down the mission. And even in the case of the French MLM officer who was killed by a vehicle ramming after the Cold War, documents were found that this was a intentional operation as retribution against a officer who they thought was very aggressive in his collection activities.
Do you happen to think or happen to know at that time, obviously this is the first death in almost 40 years, but do you think the mindset was that this could happen at any time? What with the other incidents that had happened, the shots that had been fired and the ramming of the French officer's vehicle? Did the officers then, the tour officers, did they think, well, it finally happened? Or did they think, oh my gosh, how could this have happened?
Yeah, I had the figures somewhere and I'll look for them, but really since between the time of Nicholson shooting and the beginning of the MLMs, there were 36 shooting incidents. So this was not a uncommon type event. And of those 36 incidents, 75% of them were shots that were either aimed at or hit a MLM member or vehicle. So these were aimed shots, not warning shots. So they had really been literally dodging the bullet for years. So this has been a very real and present threat. And the Soviets' talking points from the very beginning were always that a sentry on guard duty has orders to protect his guard from any unidentified intruders. And they stood by that talking point. And again, it was used over and over again to the point where it had to have become an accepted norm by international law.
Okay. I'm glad you bring that up, though, the Soviet story about what happened, because I know that there's been some talk or some theorizing, at least, that maybe this was premeditated because of James Hall passing information about Nicholson's movements in the past. Like maybe they were expecting Nicholson that day and maybe they were planning to another perceived accident. Anyway, so what do you think about that? Was it a premeditated murder or was it a trigger-happy sentry?
Yeah, it was a poorly disciplined sentry. A couple of things on that point. One is a lot of the reports that talk about this misreport the timing of the event where our US MLM members were able to get inside the tank. That actually occurred 15 months before the Nicholson shooting. A lot of reports say that it happened 3 months before the shooting, which then you could say, okay, I understand the cause and effect. It was compromised that New Year's Eve. A couple of months later, Hall provided the information, then a month later, Nicholson is killed. And also there are reports that Nicholson was involved in that event where they got inside the tank, which was not the case. He had obviously collected in that area before. He was a member of the US MLM, but that was not the case. And so as you look back at the records, there had not been a shooting before that compromise on that New Year's Eve until the February before that event until the Nicholson shooting. So after the compromise of that information, there was no discernible uptick in security that would give anybody the impression. So there was just no indication on the ground. And then when you look at it in practical terms from the espionage standpoint and the desire to protect your sensitive sources and methods, it would be unthinkable that the KGB would allow a source like Hall to be, Hall was providing the most consequential intelligence of any other spy at that time. So it'd be unthinkable that the KGB would allow commanders on the ground to be reprimanded for poor OPSEC in a manner that might compromise Hall. So from those perspectives, just don't see how it would be possible. I just believe it was the isolated actions of a undisciplined sentry.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, honestly, especially the part about not doing anything with that info for 15 months. That seems like an awfully long time to wait for some sort of retribution or anything when you put it like that.
Right.
So him being the last casualty of the Cold War, so to speak, the MLMs where they had to wind down as the Cold War ended, of course, in 1990. So how did these organizations kind of navigate those final days there at the end as the wall came down and Germany was reunified and eventually, of course, the Soviet Union fell? What happened to the MLMs?
Well, they went away. So during the latter part of the 80s, as we kind of alluded to, the U.S. was starting to get information, do analysis, understand that, hey, maybe we, had these MLMs not really analyzed correctly from the standpoint. We were looking at them as we were kind of mirror imaging ourselves, that they were these tactical intelligence collection elements, and we had this robust element, and they only had a 14-person element, and not really realizing, well, a 14-person GRU residency conducting clandestine operations and other covert support operations in a Western country, that's a pretty robust capability. So we were starting to look at that and starting to build the capability to really get after whether they were actually conducting downtown operations in Frankfurt, doing any agent meets, those type of things. So we had developed in Europe a surveillance capability to start doing surveillance operations against known SMLMF GRU members. And if you're familiar with the mentality at the time, in 1988 and even 1999, nobody saw this coming. Nobody saw the fall of the wall coming. We were on full gear with these. The Soviets were going to be our enemies to the end, and that's the way it was going to be. So as it turned out, we were just developing the capability to really go after and crack that nut. And then, when the Germans agreed to reunify in June or July of 1990, then the missions decided to cease all operations and that they would stop operations on 2 October, which was the day before German reunification.
Yeah, it's strange to see such a decades-long mission like that just kind of go away so quickly, but the whole world was changing all around them, and they were right at the epicenter of it all, really. So it was truly the end of an era there. Do you think now that we have, the benefit of decades of hindsight, what was the overall impact of these MLMs, both the Soviet and the NATO country MLMs? Were they profoundly impactful on the end of the Cold War, or what?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate about that. Certainly, they served a good purpose as far as a confidence building capability, a mutual inspection regime. Obviously, if you're talking, you're not fighting. So it was good to have those MLMs, and they did serve a purpose of, assuring each other that we weren't getting ready to go to war as long as they're there. But then again, and I'm probably not the historical expert that should perhaps give you this opinion, but from everything that I've seen, there are those who suspect, if the Soviets were going to attack, they would have shut down their mission, pulled their people out. But we know from the war plan that was compromised by Popov in 1960 that the Soviets planned to be to the Belgian border within 72 or 96 hours. We know from their plans what they planned to do with Spetsnaz sleeper agents as far as cutting off the head of NATO civilian leadership before they were able to make their decisions on releasing nuclear weapons, that they were not planning on having this long period of unambiguous warning. So I think that the MLMs either had a go-to-ground mission to support the invasion, or they were just considered to be collateral damage, expendable pawns on the board. So I don't think that, those who argue that the good purpose of the MLMs were that we would have seen them close down and leave, and this would have been a strong indicator of war. I just don't buy that based on the Soviet mentality of the time and what we know about their intentions in the time of war.
Right. I can certainly see them being willing to sacrifice those 14 guys to maintain that critical element of surprise if they're really going to attack.
Yes.
So your book doesn't just talk about the MLMs, of course. You also talk about a totally different organization with a very different mission. So can you tell me a little bit about this other U.S. Army intel activity that was active at that time in Germany, the FCA?
Yeah, the foreign counterintelligence activity. So just to take it back a little bit, when the Cold War began, the Soviets had a very centralized, deliberate, ruthless approach to intelligence, counterintelligence, disinformation. The KGB was the only Soviet counterintelligence capability. They even had counterintelligence jurisdiction over the GRU. In comparison, the U.S. had a number of different counterintelligence activities. Any U.S. agency that either collects or stores intelligence information has to have their own counterintelligence agency. So the services had very robust counterintelligence services. But again, this meant that kind of the U.S. methodology for going against this very centrally orchestrated capability was through a very decentralized kind of manner. So Europe was a ground theater. So Army counterintelligence kind of was the predominant counterintelligence capability in the theater. But what they did was they were broken down into 13 or 9 regions within the area, and each of the tactical commanders in those regions were given counterintelligence agents to kind of support their effort. So, and if you know who the intelligence leaders were at the time, these were tactical intel guys that really didn't have good perspective of counterintelligence. So our approach at that time was to kind of spread our counterintelligence capability very thin and very equally across the theater. And as Frederick the Great said, he who defends everything defends nothing. And that was kind of the counterintelligence approach, which was not very effective. And so FCA, foreign counterintelligence activity, is kind of the final manifestation of us figuring out that you can't attack a centrally orchestrated, sophisticated intelligence capability unless you use that similar approach. So FCA was the first effort on the Army counterintelligence part to recognize that, okay, we need to get our very best and brightest case officers centralized and deploy them against our very highest priority investigations. We need to take our very best technical experts and our technical capabilities, centrally locate those, and then deploy those against our most sophisticated capabilities. And FCA did, or the organization that became FCA, did support Army counterintelligence against the Smellum target in the early 80s. There were a number of technical operations against Smellum F vehicles and also some embassy vehicles. The discussion of whether that was a successful technical attack or a successful Soviet dangle, we can have that conversation some other time. But this was when, finally by the early 90s, or the early 80s rather, DoD counterintelligence was really getting serious and kind of finally organizing to combat the Soviet threat that they had been at battle with in the counterintelligence arena for the last 30 years. And then finally, FCA developed a dedicated surveillance capability that they deployed for the first time to Europe in support of the Clyde Conrad operation, which was very decisive in developing the information necessary for the arrest and conviction of Clyde Conrad. And the Conrad investigation was certainly the most important, the biggest success story for DoD counterintelligence, and probably the most important in the history of U.S. counterintelligence. So FCA kind of symbolized, and they still do today, an evolution that kind of took us 30, 40 years to figure out the best way to really get at that sophisticated Soviet capability. And so as we look at, the Soviets still do business the same way, the communist Chinese still do business in that same kind of manner. So I hope that we don't have to go through another world war and then try to figure out how to do things the right way. I hope we learn by some of those lessons as we go forward against some of these more sophisticated and determined adversaries.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard to say. I don't really keep up with current developments because how could I, of course, with everything classified and all that. But you have to wonder, we do have a long history in the U.S. and elsewhere, of course, of forgetting the lessons from the previous war. And I certainly hope that hasn't happened yet, because it sounds like FCA was going up against some of the world's best and that they held their own at a very minimum. So I hope that we haven't lost that capability at this point for sure.
Yeah, and I think that certainly was, if not the high point, a high point for the maturation of U.S. counterintelligence against the bear.
Absolutely. You mentioned in passing, you said something about the MLMF vehicles. Was that the Operation Lanky Miss? Am I thinking of the correct one there?
Yep, you are. It was
Okay.
Operation Lanky Miss, which was reported in Emerson's book, Secret Warriors.
Yes, he was a previous guest of mine several months ago. We talked about that a little bit.
Right. And yeah, so that was an operation that the Army CI was able to get control of some Smell-F vehicles when they were at a garage facility being fixed, and were able to implant some technical devices. The same thing was done for a vehicle that was ordered from the factory. And even though I like the kind of the mindset of aggressive counterintelligence operations, when you look at the principle of control, a sophisticated intelligence agency, knows that once they lose control of their vehicle, then opposing intelligence agencies can do things with it. So they would kind of have been violating the principle of control unless they did it for the very reason of being able to discover our latest and greatest technical capabilities, which I kind of suspect may have been the case, because I just don't see that the Soviets would have given us that kind of an opportunity unless they wanted to. But again, we just kind of underestimated the Soviet mindset at the time.
You're right. That's incredible. And, perfect example of why it's called the Wilderness of Mirrors, just like in the title of your book there. It's hard to know what's true and what's fiction, even after all these years.
That's true.
So this has been really fascinating. I really appreciate it. Aden, are you working on another book right now, or are you finished for the moment?
I think I'm finished for the moment. I mean, this was a story that I wanted to make sure we got out there. Again, there's a lot of the things that are told there, if it weren't told by guys like myself and some comrades that I have, they would have faded from human memory and never been told. So I thought it was important to get this one out. And there are a wealth of intelligence, counterintelligence principles, lessons learned. They're in there that, I've learned over my course of 40 some years in the business that I wanted to get out there. So mission accomplished in that regard. There are a couple of areas in the book which I could have expounded on considerably, but I didn't want that to kind of bog down the flow of some of the main points. So there is a possibility that at some point I'll get into a little more detail on some of these, juicy areas that are addressed in the book. But for now, like I said, it's mission accomplished. This is the piece that I wanted to get out there before, it kind of was lost in the sands of time.
Right. Well, mission accomplished is right, because it's a terrific book. It really held my attention. And there's so much in there that we haven't talked about. And of course, I don't want to talk about it because I want our listeners to go out there and pick up the book and read it for themselves as well. But there's some really fascinating operations that went on. A lot of the surveillance operations that you talked about, that was some of the most in-depth writing that I've seen about the complexities of conducting surveillance. And if you just see it, only in fiction movies and that kind of thing, you don't really understand how difficult that can be and to do it well. So I really appreciate that was a major portion of your book, was describing kind of moment by moment how some of these big operations went down.
Yep, I appreciate that, Justin.
Sure. So is there anywhere that our listeners can connect with you now after this podcast finishes?
Yeah, I think the best thing to do would just be contact me, Aden Magee, LinkedIn profile, and then I'll be able to get back in touch with you and we can have any discussions or coordination or collaboration that we need to.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, Aden. I really appreciate it. This has been very illuminating for sure. And I love your book, like I said.
Great, Justin. Thank you very much for having me.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101 or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes a free PDF copy of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Joel R. and Josh F. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcast or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.